Marx's theory of fictions. There are in Marx's Capital long passages which deal with the necessary role of fiction in capitalist reproduction, from commodity fetishism as a fiction which is part of social reality itself, to the topic of fictitious capital, introduced in Capital Volume 2 and elaborated in Capital Volume 3. The 3 volumes of Capital reproduce the triad of the universal, the particular, and the individual. Capital Volume 1 articulates the abstract universal matrix, concept of capital. Capital Volume 2 shifts to particularity, to the actual life of capital in all its contingent complexity. Capital Volume 3 deploys the individuality of the total process of capital. In recent years, the most productive studies of Marx's critique of political economy have focused on Capital Volume 2. Why? In a letter sent to Engels on 30th of April 1868, Marx wrote, "In Book 1, we content ourselves with the assumption that if, in the self-expansion process, £100 becomes £110, the latter will find already in existence in the market the elements into which it will change once more. But now we investigate the conditions under which these elements are found at hand, namely the social intertwining of the different capitals, of the component parts of capital, and of revenue." 2 features are crucial here, which are the 2 sides of the same coin. On the one hand, Marx passes from the pure notional structure of capital's reproduction, described in Volume 1, to reality, in which the capital's reproduction involves temporal gaps, dead time, etc. There are dead times that interrupt smooth reproduction, and the ultimate cause of these dead times is that we are not dealing with a single reproductive cycle, but with an intertwinement of multiple circles of reproduction which are never fully coordinated. These dead periods are not just an empirical complication, but an imminent necessity. They are necessary for reproduction, but they complicate the actual life of capital. On the other hand, fiction intervenes here, in the guise of fictitious capital, whose notion is further elaborated in the 3rd volume of Capital. Fiction is needed to overcome the destructive potential of complications, delays, dead periods, so that when we pass from pure logical matrix to actual life, to reality, fiction has to intervene. The 2nd volume of Capital focuses on the problem of realizing surplus value, disrupted first and foremost by time and distance. As Marx put it, during its circulation time, capital does not function as productive capital, and therefore produces neither commodities nor surplus value. Capital's circulation generally restricts its production time, and hence its valorization process. This is why industry is increasingly clustered outside of urban centers, close to motorways and airports, in order to streamline circulation. Another implication is the growing role for a credit system that enables production to continue throughout the circulation process. Credit can be used to bridge the gap in situations where surplus value has not yet been realized, and under conditions where capitalists expect future consumption of their goods and services. This may seem like rather a banal point, but it has real consequences for how the economy functions, illuminating a systemic reliance on fictitious capital, although Marx introduced this term later in Volume 3. Money values backed by yet unproduced or sold goods and services are thus the essential lifeblood of capitalism, rather than an eccentric or irregular consequence of an otherwise self-reliant system. In order to function as capital, money must circulate. It must again employ labor power and again realize itself in expanded value. Let's take an industrialist who has enough money in his bank account so that he can retire and live off the interest. The bank must loan his capital to another industrialist. The industrialist who has borrowed the money must service the loan, i.e. pay interest, out of the profits he makes. The sum of money on the market is thus redoubled. The retired capitalist still owns his money, and the other capitalist also disposed of the money he borrowed. But as the class of speculators, bankers, brokers, financiers, and so on grows, as is inevitably the case wherever the mass of capital in a country reaches a sufficient scale, the bank finds that it is able to loan out far more than it is deposited in its vaults. Speculators can sell products that they do not possess. The right kind of person is good for credit, even when they have nothing. Note how trust, i.e. interpersonal relations, re-enters the scene here, at the level of what appear to be the utmost impersonal financial speculations. The ability of the bank to make unsecured loans is dependent on confidence. In this way, the money form produces not only impersonal relations of domination, but at the same time produces interpersonal forms of domination, as fictitious capital exists as a form of appearance of value, not on the basis of the substance of abstract labor that produces the subject-object inversion, but through interpersonal forms of domination that promise future production of value as substance. Therefore, there is a different kind of subjection working on the bearers of fictitious capital, which is on the basis of an interpersonal relation forged through a contract. Rebecca Carson, Time and Schemas of Reproduction. Thus, one and the same unit of productive capital may have to support not just the one retired industrialist who deposited his savings with the bank, but multiple claims on one and the same capital. If the bank accepts 1 million from our retiree, but loans out on the basis of it 10 million to multiple borrowers, each of the multiple owners of this 10 million has equal claim to that same value of the originally deposited 1 million. This is how fictitious capital comes about. At times of expansion and boom, the mass of fictitious capital grows rapidly. When the period of contraction arrives, the bank finds itself under pressure and calls in its loans. Defaults occur, bankruptcies, closures, share prices fall, and things fall back to reality. Fictitious value is wiped out. This brings us to a formal definition of fictitious capital. It is that proportion of capital which cannot be simultaneously converted into existing use values. It is an invention which is absolutely necessary for the growth of real capital. It is a fiction which constitutes the symbol of confidence in the future. Or, as Rebecca Carson resumes this entire movement, non-capitalist variables become formally subsumed through circulation, making them necessary for the reproduction of capital, yet they are variables nonetheless necessarily exterior, described by Marx as interruptions within the movement of capital. What this means in socioeconomic terms is that we should unconditionally avoid any notion of communism as an order in which fictions no longer reign over actual life, i.e. in which we return to actual life. As Hart and Negri repeatedly insisted, there is an unexpected emancipatory potential in the craziest speculations with fictive capital. Since valorization of the working force is the key aspect of capitalist reproduction, we should never forget that in the sphere of fictitious capital, there is no valorization, no market exchange of commodities, and no labor that produces new value. And because in a capitalist society, personal freedom is grounded in the free exchange of commodities, inclusive of labor power as a commodity, the sphere of fictitious capital no longer demands personal freedom and autonomy. Direct interpersonal relations of subordination and domination return in it. It may appear that this reasoning is too formal, but one can elaborate this in a more precise way. Fictitious capital involves debt, and being indebted limits personal freedom. For the workers, debt is involved in the reproduction of their workforce itself, and this debt limits their freedom to bargain for a work contract. So where here is any emancipatory potential? Elon Musk proposed a mega-algorithm program that would manage our investments better than any stockbroker company, allowing ordinary people to invest small sums under the same conditions as billionaires. The idea is that when this program is freely available, it will lead to a more fair distribution of wealth. Although the idea is problematic and ambiguous, it does indicate the ultimate nonsense of stock exchange games. If a mega algorithm can do the work better than humans, stock exchanges could become an automatic machine. And if this works, private ownership of stocks will also become useless, since all we'll need will be a gigantic AI machine for the optimal allocation of resources. This is how the extreme of financial capitalism can open up an unexpected path to communism. However, fictions operate in the space of what Lacan called the big other, the symbolic order. And there is a fundamental difference between a subject's alienation in the symbolic order and the worker's alienation in capitalist social relations. We have to avoid the two symmetrical traps which open up if we insist on the homology between the two alienations. the idea that capitalist social alienation is irreducible since the signifying alienation is constitutive of subjectivity, as well as the opposite idea that the signifying alienation could be abolished in the same way Marx imagined the overcoming of capitalist alienation. The point is not just that the signifying alienation is more fundamental and will persist even if we abolish the capitalist alienation. It is a more refined one. The very figure of a subject that would overcome the signifying alienation and become a free agent, who is a master of the symbolic universe, i.e., who is no longer embedded in a symbolic substance, can arise only within the space of capitalist alienation, the space in which free individuals interact. Let's indicate the domain of this symbolic alienation with regard to Robert Brandam's attempt to elaborate the way to a postmodern form of recognition that overcomes ironic alienation. This is the recollective recognition structure of trust. For Brandam, quote, "This may be the part of Hegel's thought that is of the most contemporary philosophical interest and value. That is partly because he attributes deep political significance to the replacement of a semantic model of atomistic representation by one of holistic expression. It is to lead to a new form of mutual recognition and usher in the third stage in the development of Geist, the age of trust." Trust is here trust in the ethical substance, the big other, the set of established norms, which doesn't limit but sustains the space of our freedom. Referring to Chomsky, Brandam gives his own reading of the classic distinction between negative freedom and positive freedom. Negative freedom is the freedom from predominant norms and obligations, which can lead only to universalized ironic distance towards all positive regulations. We shouldn't trust them. They are illusions masking particular interests. While positive freedom is the freedom whose space is opened up and sustained by our adherence to a set of norms. As Chomsky pointed out, language enables an individual who inhabits it to generate an infinite number of sentences. This is the positive freedom of expression provided by our acceptance of the rules of language, while negative freedom can lead only to ironic alienation. But is the freedom of irony, of ironic distance, also not a form of positive freedom, grounded in a deep acquaintance with the rules? Is something like ironic alienation not inherent to those who really inhabit a language? Let's take patriotism. A true patriot is not a fanatical zealot, but someone who can quite often practice ironic remarks about his nation. And this irony paradoxically vouches for his true love of his country. When things get serious, he is ready to fight for it. To be able to practice this kind of irony, I have to master the rules of my language much more deeply than those who speak it in a flawless, non-ironic way. One can even say that to really inhabit a language implies not just knowing the rules, but knowing the meta-rules, which tell me how to violate the explicit rules. It doesn't imply making no mistakes, but making the right kind of mistakes. And the same goes for the manners that hold together a given closed community. This is why, in the old times, when there were still schools to teach ordinary people how to behave in high-class society, these schools were, as a rule, an abominable failure. No matter how much they taught you the rules of behavior, they were not able to teach you the meta-rules that regulate the subtle transgressions of the rulers. And speaking about expressive subjectivity, one also can say that subjectivity appears in speech only through such regulated violations. Without them, we get a flat, impersonal speech. And what if we imagine communism in a similar way, as a new ethical substance, a frame of rules, that enables positive freedom? Maybe this is how we should reread Marx's opposition of the kingdom of necessity and the kingdom of freedom. Communism is not freedom itself, but the structure of a kingdom of necessity that sustains freedom, the principal commitment to a cause which makes all my transgressive pleasures possible. In other words, we shouldn't imagine communism as a self-transparent order with no alienation, but as an order of good alienation, of our reliance on a thick, invisible cobweb of regulations sustaining the space of our freedom. In communism, I should be led to trust this web and ignore it, focusing on what makes my life meaningful. This constitutive alienation in the symbolic substance is missing in Kohei Sato's Karl Marx's eco-socialism, the latest, most consistent attempt to think humanity's embeddedness in nature without regressing into dialectical materialist general ontology. In his search of a pre-capitalist foundation of human life, he posits the process of metabolism between nature and humans as the ground on which the process of capital is based. This metabolism was distorted by capital, which parasites on it, so that the basic contradiction of capitalism is the one between natural metabolism and capital. Nature resists capital. It poses a limit to capital's self-valorization. The task of communists is thus to invent a new form of social metabolism, which will no longer be market-mediated, but organized in a human, rationally planned way. That's why Sato is profoundly anti-Hegelian. His axiom is that Hegelian dialectics cannot think the natural limits of capital, namely that the self-movement of capital cannot ever fully sublate, integrate, its presupposed natural base. Quote, Marx's ecology deals with the synthesis of the historical and trans-historical aspects of social metabolism in explaining how the physical and material dimensions of the universal metabolism of nature and the metabolism between humans and nature are modified and eventually disrupted by the valorization of capital. Marx's analysis aims at revealing the limits of the appropriation of nature through its subsumption by capital. Marx does not talk about subsumption under capital in abstract formal terms. He is interested in how the subsumption is not just a formal one, but gradually transforms the material base itself. Air gets polluted, deforestation, land is exhausted and rendered less fertile, etc. Sato is right to see in this rift the basic contradiction of capitalism. Once social production is subsumed under the form of the self-valorization process of capital, the goal of the process becomes capital's extended self-reproduction, the growth of accumulated value. And since the environment ultimately counts as just an externality, destructive environmental consequences are ignored. They don't count. Quote, capital contradicts the fundamental limitedness of natural forces and resources because of its drive toward infinite self-valorization. This is the central contradiction of the capitalist mode of production, and Marx's analysis aims at discerning the limits to this measureless drive for capital accumulation within a material world. Ecology is thus for Sato in the very center of Marx's critique of political economy, and this is why, in the last decades of his life, Marx was extensively reading books on the chemistry and physiology of agriculture. The reason why Marx turned to the physiology and chemistry of agriculture is clear. He wanted to study the life process of metabolism without falling into the trap of conceiving life that precedes capital in the terms of a romantic vital force. Sato's central premise is that this contradiction cannot be grasped in the Hegelian terms. This is why he mockingly mentions that Western Marxism primarily deals with social forms, sometimes with an extreme fetishism of Hegel's science of logic. But we cannot get rid of Hegel in such an easy way. When Marx wrote that the ultimate barrier of capital is capital itself, in Capital Volume 3, Chapter 15, entitled Exposition of the Internal Contradictions of the Law, quote, the real barrier of capitalist production is capital itself. We should be precise in the Hegelian sense and clearly distinguish Schranke from Grenze. Grenze designates an external limitation, while Schranke stands for the immanent barrier of an entity, for its internal contradiction. Say, in the classic case of freedom, the external limitation of my freedom is the freedom of others, but its true barrier is the insufficiency of this notion of freedom, which opposes my freedom to the freedom of others. As Hegel would have put it, this freedom is not yet true freedom. And the whole point of Marx is that capital is not just externally limited by nature, which cannot be exploited indefinitely, but immanently limited in its very concept. Which mode of relating to Hegel should then an ecologically oriented Marxism assume today? When Chris Arthur says that it is precisely the applicability of Hegel's logic that condemns the object as an inverted reality systematically alienated from its bearers, He thereby provides the most concise formulation of Hegel's logic as the logic of capital. The very fact that Hegel's logic can be applied to capitalism means that capitalism is a perverted order of alienation. Or, as John Rosenthal put it, Marx made the curious discovery of an object domain in which the inverted relation between the universal and the particular, which constitutes the distinctive principle of Hegelian metaphysics, in fact obtains. The whole riddle of the Marx-Hegel relation consists in nothing other than this. It is precisely and paradoxically the mystical formulae of Hegelian logic, for which Marx finds a rational scientific application. In short, while in his early critique of Hegel, Marx rejected Hegel's thought as a crazy speculative reversal of the actual state of things, he was then struck by the realization that there is a domain which behaves in a Hegelian way, namely the domain of the circulation of capital. Recall the classic Marxian motif of the speculative inversion of the relationship between the universal and the particular. The universal is just a property of particular objects which really exist, but when we are victims of commodity fetishism, it appears as if the concrete content of a commodity, its use value, is an expression of its abstract universality, its exchange value. The abstract universal, the value, appears as a real substance which successively incarnates itself in a series of concrete objects. That is the basic Marxian thesis. It is already the effective world of commodities which behaves like a Hegelian subject substance, like a universal going through a series of particular embodiments. In Marx's reading, the self-engendering speculative movement of capital also indicates a fateful limitation of the Hegelian dialectical process, something that eludes Hegel's grasp. It is in this sense that Lebrun mentions the fascinating image of capital presented by Marx, especially in his Grundrisse, a monstrous mixture of the good infinity and the bad infinity, the good infinity which creates its presuppositions and the conditions of its growth, the bad infinity which never ceases to surmount its crises and which finds its limit in its own nature. This perhaps is also the reason why Marx's reference to Hegel's dialectics in his critique of political economy is ambiguous, oscillating between taking it as the mystified expression of the logic of capital and taking it as the model for the revolutionary process of emancipation. First, there is dialectic as the logic of capital. The development of the commodity form and the passage from money to capital are clearly formulated in Hegelian terms. Capital is money substance turning into self-mediating process of its own reproduction, etc. Then there is the Hegelian notion of proletariat as substanceless subjectivity, i.e. the grandiose Hegelian scheme of the historical process from pre-class society to capitalism, as the gradual separation of the subject from its objective conditions, so that the overcoming of capitalism means that the collective subject reappropriates its alienated substance. The Hegelian dialectical matrix thus serves as the model of the logic of capital, as well as the model of its revolutionary overcoming. So again, which mode of relating to Hegel should an ecologically oriented Marxism assume today? Hegelian dialectics as the mystified expression of the revolutionary process, as the philosophical expression of the perverted logic of capital, as the idealist version of a new dialectical materialist ontology? Or should we simply claim, as Althusser did, that Marx only flirted with Hegelian dialectics, that his thinking was totally foreign to Hegel? There is another one, a different reading of Hegel's dialectical process itself, that leaves behind the predominant notion of this process as the process of gradual subjective appropriation of substantial content. Already decades ago, in the early years of modern ecology, some perspicuous readers of Hegel noted that Hegelian idealist speculation does not imply an absolute appropriation of nature. In contrast to productive appropriation, speculation lets its other be. It doesn't intervene in its other. As Frank Ruder pointed out, Hegel's absolute knowing is not a total Aufhebung, a seamless integration of all reality into the notion's self-mediation. It is much more an act of radical Aufgeben, of giving up, of renouncing the violent effort to grab reality. Absolute knowing is a gesture of entlassen, of releasing reality, of letting it be to stand on its own, and in this sense, it breaks with the endless effort of labor to appropriate its otherness, the stuff that forever resists its grasp. Labor, and technological domination in general, is an exemplary case of what Hegel calls spurious infinity. It is a pursuit which is never accomplished because it presupposes an other to be mastered, while philosophical speculation is at ease, no longer troubled by its other. This brings us back to the topic of fiction. Does this gesture of releasing reality, of letting it be to stand on its own, mean that we accept reality as it is in itself, outside the network of symbolic fictions? Here things get more complex. For Hegel, the form of this letting it be is knowledge, scientific knowledge in his sense of the word, which doesn't mess with its object, but merely observes its self-movement. What scientific knowledge observes is not its object in itself, but the interaction between in itself and our fictions, where fictions are an immanent part of the in itself. And it is the same with Marx, for whom, if we subtract fictions, social reality itself disintegrates. Today's experimental science, however, displays a stance towards its object which is the opposite of Hegel's. Not a stance of impassively observing the object's self-movement in its interplay with fictions, but the stance of actively intervening in its object and its technological manipulation, even creating new objects through biogenetic mutations, which simultaneously aims at how this object is in itself, independently of our interaction with it. Let's take brain science, the exemplary case of today's science. Neurobiologists and cognitive scientists like to undermine our common sense of being autonomous free agents with the claim that subjective freedom is a fiction. In reality, in itself, our brain processes are fully determined by neural mechanisms. The Hegelian answer to this is that yes, freedom is immanently linked to fiction, but in a more subtle way. To quote a well-known passage from the preface to Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. The activity of dissolution is the power and work of the understanding, the most astonishing and mightiest of powers, or rather the absolute power. The circle that remains self-closed and, like substance, holds its moments together, is an immediate relationship, one therefore which has nothing astonishing about it. But that an accident as such, detached from what circumscribes it, what is bound and is actual only in the context with others, should attain an existence of its own and a separate freedom. That is the tremendous power of the negative. It is the energy of thought, of the pure I. The power of the understanding is the power of tearing apart in one's mind what in reality belongs together. In short, the power to create fictions. One should be attentive to a key detail in the quote from Hegel. This power is not just the basic form of human freedom, it is the power of separate freedom, acquired by an object itself when it is torn out of its living context, and thus obtains a separate existence of its own. But is this power active only in our mind, while reality remains the same in itself? In other words, are we dealing with a new version of Sartre's opposition between the reality of being in itself and consciousness as the vortex of being for itself? We should recall here Marx's definition of human labor from Chapter 7 of Capital Volume 1. A spider conducts operations which resemble those of the weaver, and a bee would put many a human architect to shame by the construction of its honeycomb cells. But what distinguishes the worst architect from the best of bees is that the architect builds the cell in his mind before he constructs it in wax. At the end of every labor process, a result emerges which had already been conceived by the worker at the beginning, hence already existed ideally. These imaginings, fictions, are, of course, not just in the worker's head. They emerge out of the socio-symbolic interaction of workers, which presupposes the big other, the order of symbolic fictions. So how does this big other relate to what we experience as external reality? This is the basic philosophical problem. And at this point, we should stop.